and vice versa. When you stand poorly, yeah, good luck moving well from that position. So if you do nothing else apart from stand great, then I think you're in a pretty cool place then. Okay, so rotation. I mean, it's such a big area, this in golf. Now, I think it's unusual. Probably in any session that I do, and soon I can only imagine it's very similar for the coaches in the room as well, that it doesn't come up in most sessions that you do. There's a discussion around rotation. It's such a big thing these days within golf, and it's unusual. I said I don't use any online stuff. I have a friend of mine that does it for me, but when I occasionally do look at online stuff about once a month, it seems to be such a big area of discussion these days. So I think what's very important in them is we really appreciate and actually understand really what rotation is and what isn't rotation, and then what is rotation from a very kind of anatomical observation. So kind of like we said at the start of the discussion there, every single movement we make pretty much in life is one of rotation. My head kind of nodding and my head kind of moving that way and my feet moving this way. They're all rotational movements, just in kind of different directions and in different, what you call planes of movement. Everyone happy with kind of planes, kind of the X, Y, Z, so that this one, and that one, and then how you rotate around those kind of three positions that we have. The way typically, and again, this is a very kind of, not romantic view, but it's a pretty kind of, pretty relaxed way of saying it today, but we'll kind of keep it that way because obviously the audience mainly being coaches. That if the system or the body finds rotation very challenging, it will simply adapt and move invariably in one of two different directions, either side to side or forwards and backwards. So much of what we see, say, I know UC gave me some pretty big feedback from the sessions that I think happened a few weeks ago. And he goes, every player does the same thing. I said, just let's look at this. With a lot of movement in their pelvis this way and lots of movement this way, which is not unusual, especially when working with some of the adolescent and developing players. But typically, that when you start to see movements this way or movements this way or kind of movements that way, it's because anatomically there's other reasons as well, which I'll come on to. It's because they find it very challenging to move this way. So if the system doesn't like or finds it challenging, the ability to have that wonderful kind of spiral, that wonderful kind of, do you know the word helical? That rotational spiral that we have. If we've lost that ability to rotate, down through the skull, through the neck, and we'll talk about this a bit more in a second, kind of through the kind of rib cage, into the hip joints, into the ankles, we'll simply find ways of moving around those adaptations. So again, you can start to kind of look at this stuff that often when you observe players, just an observation, okay, that kind of lead hip's moving a long way that way, or the pelvis is drifting that way, or the rib cage elevates that way, possibly then perhaps, is that simply their way of moving around the constraints they have placed upon them? So what we see through the pelvis moving this way, or what we see through the hip moving that way, okay. So what could be happening elsewhere, which is maybe making it very challenging for them to move in that way that you like them to move. And that really is, again, I try and kind of give you as many of these kind of very kind of meaningful ways of seeing this. For me, never, ever, ever adjust anything you ever see in the golf swing. Because the minute we as observers see what players do, and the minute the kind of player inherently kind of becomes aware of it, is normally their way of moving around the problem. So that by the time we see it or they feel it, that's normally 2 or 3 frames after the actual issue or adaptation has happened. So often what we see through here is because of what they don't like doing through here. Often what they do through there in transition is because of what they don't like doing, say, through that kind of lead ankle. So I'm very much into this in a very big way, that to actually solve the problem, you actually have to work away from the problem. To get better at that, we've got to get better at this. But I think certainly I can only give you my experiences of working in golf. And again, we've all been there. This applies to me, I can assure you more than anybody. We're very, very good at kind of changing what we see. But by the time we see it, the error has already happened. So it's always the idea of working away from that problem to kind of solve the problem. So typically, if we don't like rotation in some way, we'll simply find ways of kind of moving around it, typically either the side-to-side movement, the frontal plane movement, or the forward and back, we call the sagittal, for those that are slightly more kind of movement, perhaps, aware. Okay, so let's kind of look at really kind of what is and maybe what is less so important within rotation. So actually how much you rotate in golf, certainly in backswing. Downswing's a bit different, which we'll come on to shortly. So how much we actually rotate through backswing really isn't that important. Of course it helps, but it's not that important. I could give you many case studies of, let me give you two guys that actually, did they finish in the top 10 at Augusta this week? They were certainly in the top 10 on the third day. I have to check that. Anyway, they were very prominent at Augusta this week. One's won the Masters and one's certainly been in the top 5 in the world recently. So two very, very good players that I've been very fortunate to know for some time. One of them at top of backswing has more rotation in his pelvis than the other player has in his rib cage at the top. So two of the best players in the world, two of the most relevant players still in the world, major winners, top 10 in the world players, equally as powerful. One has more rotation through here at top of backswing than the other player has through here. So good luck defining how much to rotate. Apologies on that one. The first and then the first player gets to impact before the second player gets to top of backswing. So then start looking at the time it takes to produce those rotations. Does this sound okay? Is there any interference or is it all good? Thank you. So the first player has minimal rotation in his rib cage. Is actually an impact before the player has lots of rotation in his pelvis, even gets to the top of backswing. So how would you help those two players if they both came to see you for a session? How would you help those two? I'll try and give you lots of nice challenging questions today, but I'll do it early morning. I won't do it this afternoon when you're getting all a bit. So that's when we stand up and move around and juggle and backflips and that kind of stuff. So we give you the slightly more kind of thoughtful, provocative, perhaps, discussions first thing this morning when everyone's caffeined up. And is that right? You had the most caffeine in the world in Finland. Is that true? Or why is that? Is it because of the dark lights, or you just like caffeine? Caffeine and me are not good friends. If I have caffeine, it's going to be a bad day. So I don't need caffeine. But I didn't realize that. Yes, I mean that's just the realism of rotation. And it really, I defend coaches always. I'm very much into coach is king and queen for me. So I work for coaches essentially. So the coaches are absolutely the boss in every session that I do. Absolutely the boss. And I'm always very sensitive and very defensive of coaches that you have some systems that can say that you've got to rotate X amount of in the swing well. You look at these normative values, as they're called, or these kind of reference systems that we have, that where these values come from, who knows? They're just average values, but I take the view, who wants to be average in life at anything? So you might get, say, for example, in, do you know the game cricket? Oh, someone said yes, that's quite unusual. You might go 0, 0, 0, 100, but you got an average of 25. So these values that you actually aspire to do, no one's actually ever produced. And that's often my kind of concern with some of this stuff, that people are encouraged to move in such a way that actually no one ever does. So if you took these expected ranges, which are often used within certainly kind of my background of motion capture in 3D, if you took both of those two players and kind of encouraged them to move into this average range, you'd probably destroy both of them. But the data's great, so it must have been a good session. And that will come on to a lot tomorrow around when working with data, that often you'll find in many players that the data gets better, but the play can actually get worse some days, which we'll come on to a bit tomorrow. So how do we actually know if we're helping? And how do we actually define good data, something we'll come on to a bit more tomorrow. So as far as how much you rotate, I'm going to really expand on this one as we move through the morning around actually then what helps us decide intuitively in some ways why we rotate the way we do. But at this stage, really, how much you rotate is actually not that important. However, how well you rotate how well that system produces rotation. And this is where it comes on to matter. The physiotherapist becomes, I really enjoyed working back in March when we did our things, becomes so important. You start to make those wonderful connections then with the physios and the trainers you guys work with. It's more so how well they produce rotation. I can really kind of, really force some pretty big ranges there, but how sustainable, how healthy, how helpful is that movement would be questionable. So really how well it rotates is much more important than how much it moves. This is when it gets very important, rotation now. Actually, how we produce rotation now becomes pretty important. So we'll actually do this as a little, as a stand-up. So everyone kind of stand up for me as best you can. I hope. So everyone just kind of nice and tall, hands and arms across rib cage, and just kind of rotate as you would do in a pretty playful way. So typically when, and thank you, you can relax there by the way, when we produce rotation, if we kind of stand up, the spine produces rotation pretty much like we know rotation to be. It's that wonderful kind of rotational movement. The minute you bend forwards into your start position, so when we kind of take these sort of setup positions now, many, many things then start to change within our bodies. Mainly two very, very dominant things. How the spine then produces rotation becomes very, very different. Down to its bone structure, the facet joints, that kind of stuff, for example. So just that the bone structure of the spine then slightly changes, that how we then produce rotation becomes very, very different. So when we produce rotation, when we're standing upright, the spine is pretty much rotating like you and I would know rotation to be. The minute we bend forward to produce rotation, the spine has to go through two very, very kind of dominant movements. The idea of kind of laterally flexing, or as it's known within, very good, as it's known within some kind of coaching areas, it's kind of side bend. I think that's a more kind of informal definition used within some coaching areas. And it starts to extend as it rotates. So it starts to essentially lift up, we'll call it that today. So to produce rotation, when we're in that forward bend position, the spine then has to move through elements of lateral bend and extension. When we get that wonderful rotational system, so that beautiful rotation of that spine, the spine will move through equal amounts of extension and lateral flexion, and it also laterally flexes and extends at the same time. Where you get real issues within rotations, when there's a dominance in one of those two movements or a timing issue. For example, someone gets it through lots of extension or lots of lateral bend. So just by bending forwards anatomically, just by the way we're designed as humans, so kind of blame your parents for this one in some ways, that when we bend forwards into that start position and rotate, to produce that visible rotation as we see it when we're stood upright, so to reproduce this kind of movement in our start position, the spine is actually now going through very, very different movements. It's now having to laterally bend and extend to give us that wonderful visual display. So what becomes very important then is we go through equal amounts of lateral flexion and extension, and at the same time. You can sit down, so thank you for that. We'll take a break in 10 minutes. I'm very aware that I could talk for hours, so apologies on this stuff. What also becomes, though, so very, very different then is when we're standing upright, it goes back to my favorite friend, gravity. It's one of the free things left on the planet we can still use, so make the most of it. I'm surprised they haven't found a way of charging to use gravity yet, but they will at some point probably. They charge you just to someone to make a commercial business out of it. Anyway, when you stand upright, gravity interacts very differently with our spine when we stood upright. We use kind of different kind of muscular systems, but muscles behave a bit differently when we're in upright standing compared to when we're in our start position and our goal swing. So when we're in that lovely start position, typically there's kind of big long muscles at the back of the spine, the big kind of the paraspinal muscles, the erector spinal muscles, depending on what reference you use. not as active. They're slightly more kind of the tension in those muscles is much lower. So we kind of produce rotation, but we'll call it easy today, just to keep it pretty chill. However, when you bend forwards into your start position, those muscles then become like little handbrakes at the back, little kind of braking systems, because when we bend forwards, it's their role to prevent gravity pushing us downwards. So everything changes in golf when you bend forwards. It's a real pain, but that's what makes it such a wonderful game that we have. That the minute we bend to rotate from this position, pretty easy for most of us. The minute we go into these start positions, it's mad at what changes inside of us that allow what we see is pretty much the same movement still, which we know is very, very different. So when you bend forwards, those big muscles, those big tissues run all up the back of your body, start to kind of go and really kind of put the brakes on to essentially stop gravity kind of allowing us to kind of headbutt the floor in some ways. The challenge is when those muscles become very active, one of their main roles in life is to then prevent rotation. So we've got this wonderful conflict in many ways. Golf is such a game of conflicts, which we'll come on to as we move through the 2 days. But the way we stand anatomically is designed to really reduce and constrain rotation, but yet we play a game that really demands pretty high levels of rotation. That's a confusing thought for the morning. I think maybe that's why you drink so much caffeine, perhaps. There's too many of these thoughts that go through the day. So again, in a playful way, apologies, if you can just maybe stand up again. Sorry. I just like you standing up, and there's going to be no chairs tomorrow. I'm going to lay the room out differently. Stand up, sit down. There's going to be bean bags on the floor tomorrow. I'm just going to sit cross-legged. So let's just start to, again, get that awareness as best we can. Nice and tall, just kind of make some rotation. Just kind of reference what it means to you, what it feels to you when I stand that way. And you guys can do it pretty good, actually. Everybody go into their start position now. And just start to, I'm reluctant to say easy, but we'll use the word easy today, but keep things very kind of low level. Does it just become a little bit more challenging? And to really give you a very, very scale of this, go as far forward as you can and start to rotate for me. I'm hopeful most of you start to rotate a lot less. Just gets a little harder. Gravity's now really pulling us downwards, so those big muscles at the back are really kind of the kind of handbrake. The more you bend forwards, just the bone structure shifts slightly in the spine, so it then becomes even harder to produce those rotations. Another one to play with, and I'll actually go through this now. I think it's pretty important. Then we can take a little break before we kind of, just for 2 minutes. Does anyone actually know where rotation, apart from my dear friend in the corner, so you need earplugs now in a good way. He's very good, by the way. I was really enjoyed working with him back in March. There's a philosophical discussion behind this and a much more evidence-based approach. It depends on where you want it. I like to live between both worlds. So a lot of the people think rotation starts in the diaphragm, how you breathe, and there's a lot of connection back to breath and rotation. But then you look at some of the more clinical research. Rotation really starts up and around the kind of the top of the neck, really kind of C2 really is where pretty much where the skull sits on the neck there. So to rotate, as you and I would see it through swing, rotation actually starts pretty much up at the base of the skull. So to get that kind of wonderful rotational ribcage or thorax movement that we see, for that to happen through here, it actually starts pretty much up top. So when people start moving the necks around, very good. So it actually starts here. So to get that wonderful kind of rotational kind of thorax movement, to actually, I call it, it's a bit like the way a snake moves. Snakes, for me, is some of the best movers that I've ever, that wonderful movers that we have. It's kind of scale by scale. That's pretty much how rotations produce vertebrae by vertebrae, how we rotate through the neck, down to that kind of upper thorax, through the kind of upper rib cage, into the diaphragm, into the hip, and then down into foot and ankle. So that really is kind of more how we produce rotation. almost going back then to the start of the morning, when we live in these very kind of forward positions, as we often do, it can really change what we call the axis, where rotation starts from. One reason why many people, when they get to an age in life that have played golf, have lots of kind of neck and upper spine pain is because when we live in these very kind of forward positions, it essentially kind of constrains and closes this part of the spine, the neck. So rotation often then starts about here. So some of you may have had kind of base of the neck, top of the kind of rib cage pain through golf, especially the more advanced and more established players in the room. A lot of it can connect back to when we live in these very forward positions, we lose the ability to rotate through here. So we get very dominant kind of around kind of C7, T1 for you. So it's one reason why, again, if anyone's had neck pain or upper spine pain, God, my neck feels a little bit stiff today. Normally, that's another way of saying we've really just shifted and changed where we're producing rotation through that body. You can, my mistake, sorry. So on this one, go back to the idea of being a centimetre taller, chin down, kind of point your nose forwards rather than point it outwards. That lovely kind of wide rib cage, long neck, and then just into that start position. And just start to make some rotations for me, ladies and gents, once again. Just start to, again, very intrinsically, it's about you these 2 days. Where you feel rotation, how you rotate, what it means to you. If everyone can stand up now for me, and again, do this obviously to a level that you're comfortable doing this, so you mustn't obviously do it if anyone feels a bit kind of, if there's any pain. Really let that neck go forwards, very compressed in that rib cage. Then take your start with that really kind of slightly fetal in some ways position that we have, then into your start position. And then make some rotations. And then just start to then relate back to how rotation may change for you when you live in that very kind of forward. A little different. It's just life. So it goes back to that kind of first slide. It's just how we move around the frames we have and how we produce rotation. Thank you. You can sit down. That's great. Someone is taking it seriously. Someone tops off now that it's getting serious. There's actually a reason why I'm not being lazy. I'm sure, but when I'm speaking and working, I typically stand with my hands like this because it helps remind me to have that lovely wide rib cage, long neck. So when I do present in these environments and when I'm working with players, they must think I'm lazy. I'm not. It's just my way of having that lovely kind of wide rib cage, tall neck. So I stand that way, not through being lazy, I can assure you. It's just how I try and do things. Okay, one final bit, then we'll have a little 2-minute break then. Perhaps the most important part when looking at rotation. So we look at how much it rotates, not that important. How well it moves, vital. How you produce it is very important. It starts through the neck, goes into the upper rib cage. And we'll spend a bit of time on this actually. I may just quickly go through one more thing in a second before we have a little 2-minute, maybe grab a coffee for 2 minutes. Possibly the most important part to look at when it comes to looking at rotation is actually where we first adapt in rotation. So rotation is only of any value until the point of adaptation. At what point do we adjust? So just allow me to expand on that. So I might, for example, do a pretty good job at start a backswing and then start to, so I'll do it from target line view so I'll do it in 2 different positions, so I hope you can all see. So rotation's only of real value until I start to adapt. So if I start to kind of adjust and move this way, or for the people in this side of the audience over here. So hopefully you all see. So rotation's only of real importance until I start to maybe adjust or adapt in movement. From there on, it really isn't rotation, it's more movement. So it's kind of how you define those two influence, then that's more now moving rather than rotating. An example, but this could appear on video on camera, so again, I'm very aware that people in different positions, so I'll try and stand where you can all hopefully see this. This looks like I've had lots of rotation on camera. The reality is there's nothing really happened through my spine at all, but in that kind of reference system of mirrors and cameras and even three-dimensional motion capture systems are no different. This could appear to be, I've got huge amounts of rotation. I've actually rotated nothing. I've just moved those segments through space. That's very, very different that. So often when you look at players, it's more what we see is just movement, how they're adapting for the inability to rotate. This hopefully is rotation. That wonderful kind of spiral that we have, it goes through the skull, to the jaw, to the neck, upper rib cage, into that kind of pelvis, into knee, foot, and ankle. So the real important part here, ladies and gents, really is you only look at rotation until we first start to adapt. Now, where you adapt is vital, possibly the most important part of all this discussion, because where you adapt typically reveals where the imbalances sit, really. So if you get someone adapts immediately in swing, an example being this, or if we've all been around, that's players, that's just what they do. When we're looking at it from an anatomical observation and certainly a rotational observation, typically the imbalance sits up top. Neck, even deep up into their jaw, skull, that kind of stuff, upper spine areas. So if they've lost the ability to kind of have that wonderful rotation through that neck, that initial move and backswing is almost their way of moving around it. So if you observe someone, it adapts immediately or adjusts immediately as they start back. Typically, when we look at more anatomically, look up top for where there might be some issues. Consequently, if you then get someone that adapts much later in the swing, which is actually me, ironically, for different reasons, so it does a pretty good job to start a backswing and then starts to adapt. Normally the imbalances are lower down, foot and ankle, hip, maybe lumbar spine, low back. So it's a real kind of slightly kind of crude visual reference that, again, with no system, just you and I as the player and the coach perhaps in this case, if you start seeing someone really have lots of adjustments in their swing, if it happens very early in swing, normally it's up top. If it happens much later in swing, normally it's a bit down below. And it'd be interesting when we have the two, I think there's a young lady and a young man coming this afternoon, and hopefully we'll get one of each again tomorrow. When we start looking at them, just start to observe this, where they really adapt in swing. That's kind of how, when using the 3D data that we have, what I look at is where's that initial adaptation, where's the real behavior change in those plots to start with. Great. That really starts to kind of hopefully tell me in some ways that there might be some issues up top, down below, in the middle. But when this is a slide from a very good friend of mine in the US, a guy called Brendan McLaughlin. Brendan and I work very closely together, wonderful physio, and so I have to thank Brendan for this slide. And a lot of research that has been done in recent years around really what controls how you rotate in golf. It's just the segment shape that you have. So if you've got someone, we'll kind of look at the two on the left, just to keep it kind of slightly on schedule today. If you've got someone with a very wide rib cage and a wide pelvis, so just bone structure, segment shape, depth, size, just because of the way, just the way they're made, really. So really wide rib cage and wide pelvis. Those type of humans can actually rotate a lot less to produce the same amounts of force as different body structures. So you just get someone, trying to think of an example, I can't think of one actually, but I will, not out very soon, just a really big rib cage and a really wide pelvis. They don't actually have to rotate that much in their swings, as you were very accurate in saying, to produce tremendous forces still. So if you want to go into bigger stuff, they're called vortexes. Vortexes are the internal pressures that we produce in our system. So to get these wonderfully powerful, very explosive movements, all the pressure, how we're moving fluid in our system, produces something called a vortex, that real powerful, explosive internal movement. Those guys can actually rotate not a great deal to produce tremendous amounts of pressure. Equally so, then you then have the blue, the narrow configuration. So an athlete with a very narrow rib cage and a very narrow pelvis, they can rotate much more than Mr. and Mrs. Wide and Wide, but they have to move down more in their swing as they rotate to produce the same amounts of force and pressure. So it then really opens up that wonderful, I forgot your name, sorry. I'll let him say that. And what he mentioned, and was such a great question around certain people will encourage you have to rotate X amount and you've got to all move that way. The reality is what will control how much you rotate and what controls the direction you rotate in is just the shape of your segments. So this is more of a question than an observation. How can we encourage everybody to maybe produce the same movements in swing and all embrace the same philosophies and aspire to move in the same way? Because what controls it is just the shape of the frame that you have. An example being, how can we encourage everyone to elevate in the backswing when the narrow human has to move down more? So this is where, like with Mate, for example, working with the physios becomes so important once more. Once you establish just the shape of this, I'm pretty average at most things in life, unfortunately, but when you've got if you've got a very, very narrow pelvis and a very narrow rib cage, just an observation, we need to encourage those people just to actually move down slightly as they rotate through backswing to then produce the same amounts of force and that wonderfully elastic, explosive movement in downswing, because that's just the frames they have. You've got a really big kind of Viking, kind of big rib cage, big pelvis. They don't have to move that much to produce force. So for me, it comes back to really how good you want to be at what you do. That's the question we need to look at. How good do you want to be at this? Some guys, and this is all cool, I mean, it's not a critique. Some guys are just happy doing what they do. Brilliant. That's fine. That's absolutely good for them. Some guys want to be good at this stuff. So it really comes back to how good you want to be and really to really understand movement and why we move and why players, some rotate more, some rotate less, as you rightly said. Some elevate, some move down. It's because of the shape of the segment, how big it is or how narrow it is. Then you got things like narrow, wide, wide, narrow, which you then get localized, more movement in one segment, less movement in another segment. For example, if you've got, say, narrow ribcage, wide pelvis, you'll probably get more rotation through that kind of thorax area than you will get through lower limb, and vice versa, perhaps on wide and narrow. So just one final thing, just to go. So now I'm going to start sharing some cases. I know we've got on a pretty tight time schedule today, so I think lunch, we have to sit down at midday. So just some considerations, and I like sharing this stuff because I think it's important we understand this. And I actually put this in. This is actually me, the first one. I developed a shoulder issue in my kind of early 20s, and we actually connected it back to when two of my wisdom teeth were taken out. So when two of my bottom teeth were removed in the early 20s, it started to adjust my neck slightly. If you actually look at teeth, there's such a big one on rotation that the only mammals that can walk on day one are born with their molar teeth. So we normally start to walk as human beings when our molar teeth come through. If you look at mammals like cows, for example, that come out the female and can walk on second one, they're born with their teeth. So teeth are so important on movement. A lot of what you call, do you know the word proprioception, awareness of movement? Connect back to our teeth again. And we have a tremendous amount of receptors, sensors in our teeth. And often when there's been dental-based conditions, or like, teeth removal in my case, it can really create things like the inability to produce pressure in our system, still bite pressure. It can change our jaw shape. So when my teeth came out, I had a real shift in my jaw, and it then really kind of migrated through my body into my shoulder. So I had a shoulder issue which took years to really understand. We actually connected back to teeth. And when I started playing with some kind of gum shields, like the boxers wear, my shoulder was fantastic. So really the teeth and the jaw hugely connect into rotation. The head position we talked about today is very important. But I want to talk about this a bit today, because it kind of goes back to a question just asked me a while ago about the concept of the X factor, which many of you, if not perhaps most of us, would have experienced at some point maybe in our coaching careers. True, untrue? So the idea, again, you look at, this is just life. I mean, all we do in life is replace old myths with new myths. That's the reality of humans. We only think it's only true today, isn't it, if you think about it? So we just replace these old myths with new ones. And it's only in 5 years' time I go, was I really saying that back in Finland in November 2020? But that's a cool place to be, I hope. So the idea of kind of pelvis ribcage separation is really simply not that true. Rotation is only really of huge value from above the diaphragm. So the diaphragm's about here, so where the ribcage opens up. Here's our kind of diaphragm area, which I think most of us are familiar with. Rotation or separation, as I should call it, is only really of importance above the diaphragm. So the idea of the X factor really just needs to be more refined, perhaps, and I think more accurately defined, as you so rightly say. It's how much can we move the upper thorax, upper rib cage, from the lumbar spine and pelvis. The pelvis and lumbar spine, in some ways, are almost a very cohesive kind of paired segment. So it really could be or should be, how much can we move this independent of that, not how much can we move this independent of that. So when we look at separation, rotation, X factor, call it what you want, its ability to move this part above this part. So everyone stand up for me. You knew this was coming. You sat down for at least 6 minutes. Crudely, your diaphragm's about here, so kind of pop your hand about here for me. And then almost, I kind of use my index finger, middle finger, my thumb, kind of up around the clavicle, your kind of collarbones there. I mean, again, just be very aware of this. So kind of very quietly, how much can you move that upper thorax independent of the hand? So how much can you move the top hand independent of the bottom hand? That really is separation, or X factor as it's more informally known perhaps in golf coaching. It's not, I mean, so much kind of low back issues have connected back to pelvis ribcage separation. It really is the pelvis and the lumbar spine. So even if you, I don't sit down there, by the way. So anyone find that really challenging? I know I do, yeah. You look at it in transition, so when we move in transition, it's how much can we move that lumbar spine and pelvis independent of the upper thorax, not pelvis and rib cage. So very, very important that really is the separation. It's really what happens up above is the important bit. So for those that are more anatomically aware, kind of T6 to T8 is kind of where the diaphragm is. It's what happens above the kind of 6th, 7th, 8th rib is the real important bit. I mean, breath, how we breathe, I mean, really connects back to rotation. A lot of good stuff that I've been exposed in the past around using the out breath to start backswing. So as you exhale, so as the rib cage starts to deflate and the diaphragm starts just to sit downwards on that lovely in-breath, and as you exhale, so a lot of stuff you can do around breath and breathing just to really help rotation. A lot of us kind of breathe up into our necks and hold it, and the rib cage inflames and expands and it'll get a bit sticky. So certainly you actually look at, say, anxiety within golf, which we've all experienced. I mean, first tee and even talking to you guys today, you're always nervous because that's a good thing. A lot of a lot of the neurophysiology of anxiety connects back to breathing. It's more of a physiological, certainly at least it's how it's now being researched, that anxiety is actually more of a physiological response rather than it was perceived before. Maybe it's just a neurological one that's more how our breathing patterns change. We get very shallow, very fast, kind of stuff. So certainly when you have those slightly anxious moments, as we all do, when we play and perform in these environments, for example, just using that lovely out breath. So there's a phrase in England called, if in doubt, breathe out. Not sure if you've heard that one, but by using the out breath to actually allow rotation to happen. So, probably the last time this morning, just stand up for me again. I find any excuse to stand up. Sorry, ladies. Beg your pardon? Depends. Yes, you will. You'll get everything. I've got a huge file prepared for, so there's nothing you won't get today. Just looking at how breath works. So if everyone, again, arms across rib cage into the start position. Take a huge deep breath in, hold it and rotate. So hold that breath in. Just kind of feel whatever you feel, experience what you experience. Come back to your start position. Big deep breath, and on the out breath, just coordinate that with rotation. I'm hopeful some of you find it slightly more realistic to rotate just using breath. Fair, unfair, or rather than up into your neck and makes it challenging. You can completely sit down and relax until lunch now. I promise you. Some other areas which we need to consider around rotation. It's one of my little irritations. Sunglasses in golf irritate me for some reason. Don't know why, but they do. For two reasons. I mean, why sunglasses are so important. Yes, you've got that wonderful conflict again. And we'll talk about conflicts a lot tomorrow, that even to rotate this way, essentially you've got the head rotating that way, but the rib cage going that way. That's a conflict in rotation. You've got the cervical spine, the top of the spine rotating for right-handed players. Obviously for yourself, just invert this. Essentially you've got the neck rotating anti-clockwise and the rib cage rotating clockwise. So to rotate this way, essentially is that movement in the head. So that's a conflict in rotation. So we've got that wonderful conflict, eye health, UV protection, obviously very important. The challenge with the movement then becomes is that sunglasses can really narrow our peripheral vision. So the challenge becomes, it's almost like you start to do some rotations in this position, can be really quite challenging because it really narrows that wonderful peripheral gaze that we have. So it can really narrow our visual perception. So we often then start to move a lot with sunglasses on. So again, you get perhaps in the summer months, obviously I know in Finland it's very light until late. So perhaps some of the players will use sunglasses for the play and just start to explore just glasses, make them rotate differently. The other big one where sunglasses can be not as helpful, are you familiar with something called circadian rhythms, the rhythm of the day? It's like kind of biology that you kind of, the moon in sun kind of cycles, daylights. And so to give you an idea, the sun gives off about 100 different frequencies of light a day. So the sun's changing frequency about 100 times a day. So often when you have sunglasses on, you get the same frequency of light projected onto the brain throughout the day. So it really can start to play with our rhythm of the day just because you've always got that kind of one light, one frequency. So, sunglasses can be helpful for many things, but actually quite unhelpful for some other areas. The environment, we are, through design, environmentalists, humans. I always, the idea of saying mental health issues, for me, it should be more environmental health. It's just how we perceive our environment controls our behaviors and our moods, for example. So I think we have environmental issues rather than mental issues as golfers. So the environment, you go to, say, the Open Championship next year at St George's, which is actually the closest one, I think, maybe to Finland. It's in the pretty far southeast of England, down near the literally the tunnel. If you then look at how they rotate there compared to, say, Augusta, for example, you'll get very different rotational movements just because the environment is different. Windy conditions versus very humid conditions, you'll rotate and move more. So the environment hugely controls how you rotate. Footwear, I mean, don't start me on shoes. I mean, shoes really are the root of most bad things in life. You know, for me, the best shoe is still skin. I think the more advanced the shoe, the less advanced the foot. So tomorrow we should go barefoot in no chairs. And my wife probably doesn't like me for many reasons, but two really reasons I annoyed her initially when our daughter was born was no shoes, no chairs. Because it just destroys everything for me. You put them in these shoes and their feet start to move and they walk funny. And obviously chairs because we're earlier on. So footwear, tremendous influence. Obviously clubs. Certainly for those working with, say, even pre-adolescent players, that it's very hard these days. So it certainly was when I was a junior to find equipment the right length, especially if you say a 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old. So a lot of those kind of movements that we have just connect back to often using very long, very heavy clubs. So much of those kind of rotational movements get so deeply coded in here, which then trying to pick through that at 18, 19, 20 can be quite challenging because they're so coded to move this way because of the clubs that they use. So very, very important that. And those kind of adapted, those dominant movements that we have, it's like those kind of postures. So, and many, many more. So when it comes to rotation, it's a bit more advanced than, like you rightly said, 90 degrees, 45 degrees. I mean, where that came from is a discussion we can have a different day. I guess you've got to start somewhere. But when we look at rotation, it's a bit more involved in that. And I would really say, for sure, there's many things we can look at when we reviewed it. We're going to do some case studies now. It comes back to just the frames we have, how we move around, the postures we have, really in a more playful way, is a priority. So that's that lovely long neck, wide rib cage, be a centimeter taller. How well you rotate is more important than how much you rotate. And then what really controls rotation mainly is just our shapes. Mrs. Narrow versus Mr. Big or vice versa will really control how much you rotate. So that's where I think we're obviously working with Matty and the other physios and conditioning coaches that you may work with, just start to explore that. If they got really wide rib cages, wide pelvises, they may not rotate that much. If you then got, say, when I was a junior, very slim, narrow, I had to rotate more because I could. But I had to actually move down slightly. So to get people like me to kind of move this way and back swing is intellectual failure of the highest level for me. That is intellectual dishonesty of the highest order. To try and encourage elevation and extension of the spine when I have to, through design, move downwards to produce force. And I think golf needs some intellectual honesty at the moment. I think it's got completely dishonest with some of the philosophies out there. Anyway. That's my one little for today. Okay, is everyone happy with that? Any questions on what we discussed so far this morning, or would you like me to expand or review, or happy just to keep cruising? And yes, sir. That's a nice question. Who would I... Normally, if there's, for example, if they have an issue of pain, so if you get someone that moves in such a way that clearly irritates their body, and through elevation reduces that, absolutely yes. I would encourage that. I can only give you my experiences. It's only I'm only a sample of one. I've yet to see any real established player, and I've been blessed to work with, not as about this, but a lot of very good ones, who actually elevates and extends in the backswing. There's a massive difference in the spine extending to actually moving into extension. So the spine will always extend because that's anatomy, that when we bend forwards, it has to extend to produce rotation. And this is where I think some of the 3D data has become quite harmful to the coaches. Like I said, I defend coaches. Coaches for me are the kind of kings and the queens for me. That coaches that haven't really... Again, I say this with nothing but politeness. So don't really haven't really looked at why those plots display the way they do, why those 3D plots are being mapped the way they are, what's actually happening to show that the spine extends. If you just see the spine extends, well, I go and start to do this then. No, it simply doesn't happen. So there's a massive difference in the spine extending, actually going into an extended value. And I can't recall one player that I actively know that purposely elevates in backswing. I think a lot of this has come from people getting data, and I mean this with love, really do, without really understanding how those plots are produced. Oh, everyone extends, we're going to teach this stuff then. No. Everyone's wrist does that in transition. No, it does that because of gravity and just the interaction, the weight of the club. It does that because it's just the physics we're being exposed to. I'll go and teach this stuff then. That's why I think we need some intellectual honesty back. But that's Instagram, and you can say what you want on Instagram because there's no consequence. Any other questions on Everyone cool? Good. So let's give you some little case studies now. I mean, this is hopefully, oh yeah, sorry, you're over here as well. I keep moving out of the way, but I'm in dual screens. I think most of us have experienced players like this. Again, you get to an age in life where we all start to get a bit kind of, just because of what we discussed at the start of the morning, sitting down, gravity, that kind of stuff. And these very kind of forward heads, and certainly very prevalent with some of the more mature players and the more developed players. And it really goes back to that concept, and much of what we see in swing really connects back to how they move around the frame that they have. So that really the idea that really never really change what you see or feel. Go understand why they move that way. And then equally so that often the sooner someone adapts in swing, normally represents the imbalances much further up top. So I'm going to play a little video now for you, which I hope it plays. Sometimes it doesn't. So that's how it then looks in our start position, which I think most of us have recognized or certainly been around players like this through time. So I'm going to play this through. Good. So let me just very quick, I'm going to do it this way if you don't mind, because it might be easier. And it's come out, that's annoying. Okay, let's do it this way. So there's two values on the screen there. So in the top left-hand corner, we have a value called lead wrist. So for those flexion, extension, so wrist flexing, wrist bending backwards, extension, so the FE. So when it's an E value, the wrist is slightly extended and backwards. When it's that way, it's fantastic. Yeah, it's in a, so for you, this would be your right wrist for you, it's being the lead wrist. And then we have the pelvis thrust. So the thrust is the movement forwards of the pelvis. So like we discussed at the start of the morning, if the human system doesn't like rotation, it will invariably move in a forward or backward adjustment or side-to-side movement. So the frontal plane or the kind of sagittal plane direction. Kind of goes back to that great question you asked. I think you're absolutely right there. You will see many players might elevate because it's how they move around and balances. So if you have someone with a neck issue, for example, that kind of works. So yeah, there's always a reason why you'd encourage that. But I would look at improving the neck than just saying move upwards. But you're right to say that. Yes, sir. When you make the calibration, in which position is? Absolutely off the scale important. The data is only as credible as the calibration. And certainly, at least I hope so, my system, it's ridiculously precise and accurate. So if the calibration is off, it becomes of no value because it's very, very important. So like a lot of these 3D systems don't have actual calibrations, so it makes the assumption more absolutely the same, which we know from the rib cage and pelvis slide, which is simply not the same. So that's a very good question, yes. So calibration is absolutely priority number one. Otherwise, the data has no credibility. Yeah, so I calibrate through the elbow, the top of the wrist, and the knuckles. But you can see this in live this afternoon. So that's how I define the anatomical axes of that joint. So you have, in motion capture, it depends on what systems people have. You have a global reference and then localized anatomical references in that system. So every segment has its own reference system. Where I calibrate controls that. So calibration is vital, absolutely vital. Okay, so hopefully this plays and I can pause it. Here we go. So the red line is the path that the hand or hands go back on. And then the blue line, guys, today is the path the club head goes back on. So pretty much in that first movement back, so I mean, it's one of those real typical common movements that I think many of us have been exposed to, that we all kind of do. Certainly in some of the more, I said, the more advanced and more established players that we work with. But you look at really three very revealing things there, that how that wrist went from a very high E, a very extended position, to a very high flex position. Let's call that 3/4 back, half back, just for discussion, and we'll keep it easy today. So a real evident change in how that wrist moved, the orientation of that wrist in backswing. Equally so, a very high F value now, so the pelvis is moved forwards, which is why you see a real misalignment between the path the club goes on versus the path the hands go back on. So much of what you see with players like this, they kind of tell these stories now, they kind of tell these connections now. It's simply that player's way of saying, okay, how do I get here from here? Now, the thing about the brain is always doing way before it does. So the brain's doing many, many things before it actually does it. So it's almost like the brain kind of knows in space, okay, if the neck's there, and the hip's there, and that kind of lives there, but I want to get there, but that's not going to happen. So it's kind of doing these kind of codes way before we actually do things. So it's almost like it goes, right, how do I get here from here when I live in that position? Well, that kind of figures. So not one of the worst things you can do, but one of the worst things we could do for people in this position here is, well, let's get the club and hands in a better place and better matched up and avoid that wrist moving that way. And let's avoid the pelvis moving that way. That's simply their way of moving around those adjustments that they have. So to actually get better at this and get better at that, we've got to get better at this, which kind of goes back to that question which you rightly asked, by the way. So when you start seeing, oh, why is the hand and club pass so mismatched, and why is there so much thrust in the pelvis, and why is the wrist now very flexed to the top of back? So, well, yeah, I get that, but understanding why you move that way, it is a much, much better question. And that hopefully, for those that were able to maybe observe some of the sessions we did back in March now, was the real kind of theme and thread that run through the kind of 3 days we did, which felt like 50 days thanks to UC's schedule. Thank you, UC. My record in one day is 21 sessions, and it almost finished me off, so that was a long day. Normally I do about 5 or 6, but we had a busy 3 days that day, and that week in a very, very good way. Is to kind of look at why they do this. And this is where I think some of the 3D data, again, going back to your question, is actually quite harmful. We don't really understand what the player is doing to produce that value. It actually becomes of no value. It actually becomes quite harmful. So then also going back to, again, just to give you some live examples of things we discussed on this morning, that the sooner someone adapts in swing, the imbalances are normally where? Down below, or typically, there's always exceptions, always exceptions. Someone may have a really poor foot and ankle movement. Someone, the subtalar joint could be in a really poor place. But typically, when you get people really adapt that way so quickly in that first move, there's normally, in this particular player's case, stuff at top. So we've got to get better through that neck, wide rib cage, long neck, kind of nose forwards, that kind of American football kind of pad posture. Then I'll be curious to see how they can start to move through here, and then how they can get that independent rotation above the diaphragm, rather than, he'd be a great example of probably displaying values of 90 degrees, as you rightly call it, rotation. Or is it 90 degrees of movement? actually the rotation they produce is very minimal, which is we'll come on to tomorrow when we talk about how people produce distance, which we'll come into a lot actually tomorrow morning about how these powerful players produce length. Very good player, this guy, European Tour winner recently. He's in the top, is he in the top 80 in the world now? He's in the top 90, so very, very good player, very established player. And certainly one of the best people also that I've been privileged to be around. One of the more kind of common, and there's actually some pretty big reasons why it's still possibly, I'll put these two kind of slides in, is being the two dominant adaptations we see in many players. So the real ones we often get are this one, and that one, when that rib cage is shifted left and the pelvis is shifted right. So from that kind of, the behind view, you can hopefully all see how the rib cage is slightly positioned to the left of his pelvis, or the pelvis is positioned right with rib cage. Most of you kind of happy, you can see that on screen. And there's many, many reasons why you see that. You can go into some very kind of deep reasons that most of our organs are on this side of our body, get the odd human is on the left. So we are, through design, more compressed on our right side. So therefore, when we breathe, we inherently breathe more into our left lung. The left lung has bigger capacity. So every breath we take actually pulls us a bit this way. Then we have the dominance of golf, one-sided, high volume, high frequency, high speeds. So just through adaptation, we start to live in these positions. So there's many, many reasons why we start to kind of over life have these little pulls this way. Organ placement, breath, dominance of sport, that kind of thing. And certainly when you kind of even then look at, for those you working again with adolescent players that go through that wonderful kind of pubescent phase and that wonderful growth, the height, it's called peak height velocity, the change in growth around about, those kind of teenage years. So they actually grow in these postures, some of these players. So they come in as a 13-year-old, or whatever they are, wonderfully kind of how mum and dad made them, and then at 15, they come out looking a bit like this because they've grown through life in that kind of dominant posture. That's my excuse anyway. That dominant posture way back when. So that real kind of shearing, that shifting in those two segments. So this is why I liked your question. I forgot your name, sorry. Yeah, I like that question. Yeah, I mean, because a lot of some of the, and it's interesting, when I was in overseas this year, it seemed to be a daily defense. I had to defend in some ways. I thought, I don't know why it's me defending this, because it wasn't my work or question. That how many people now actively encourage the pelvis to move that way at the start of backswing. Often when you see those movements, it's simply because people live in this position. So the body, do you know the word homeostasis in Finnish? So when you get hot, you sweat. When you get cold, you shiver. It's how the body regulates kind of its internal well-being, temperature. It's a bit like that within movement. Posture has a form of like a regulation, we'll call it homeostasis. So often the very first move you'll make within movement is to put yourself back to where you perceive the middle to be. So when we live, let me come further back and I'll show this chap in a second. When we live in these positions, our first move is to put ourselves back to where we perceive our middle to be. So much of these kind of big shifts in the pelvis and these big lateral movements in the pelvis you see often connect back to players such as this particular guy on screen here, simply placing themselves back to their perceived middle. So some of the more typical workarounds that you see here. So we have two values on screen. We have the pelvis sway. So again, just for those that are less familiar with some of the values, the sway value, the side-to-side kind of movement of the kind of pelvis. And then the PT value, that's the forward and bend, or forward and backward bend relationship of the pelvis and the rib cage. So it's the numerical difference between how much the rib cage is forwards relative to the pelvis. So it's a predictor, an estimation of the spine. Almost going back to one of the questions earlier on around some of these 3D systems that discuss what the spine does. Unless you have a sense on every single vertebrae, then how can you measure what the spine's doing? That's why I'm very precise in my what I call it the pelvis and thorax, how they interact. It's a prediction, an estimation of what the spine does, but it ain't the spine. You need a sense on every vertebrae to know what the spine does. There's certainly no motion capture system I'm aware of, even in laboratories, at least to my knowledge, that can measure what the spine does yet. You would need 24 sensors and then some to really know that. So we just play this person into backswing now. I mean, almost before the clubs even got to kind of parallel or half back in backswing, how there was a tremendous, lateral shift in that pelvis. And for those that are more familiar with some of the 3D plots, so you've got the top plot in the top right-hand corner. The blue plot is tracking and mapping that lateral sway in the pelvis. When the plot goes downwards, it represents the pelvis moving laterally away from the target. Almost immediately in that first move, it drops downwards and then it actually starts to go very flat for the rest of the backswing. So once they've essentially put themselves back in the middle, because they live so far to the left, it then actually starts to rotate that way. So it's not, I mean, it's been just I don't know why it was a defense I had to defend this year when I was working overseas. Take them to the top. Where people actively encourage lots of shift in the pelvis and then rotation. It's just how we get back to the middle. Huh? Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I say this with, I think, yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's not helpful when you look at it, when you remove golf from discussion, look at it more anatomically, it just doesn't help that approach. I think, I've yet to meet Koepka, but I think this year's been good for him because it doesn't have to play. He's had a chance to look at his knee and his hip and his ankle and his wrist. Obviously, he's missed a few majors in recent times. I mean, what a wonderful player anyway. I mean, what a wonderful player, but it's, yeah, yeah, absolutely right. But we'll talk about this tomorrow. I mean, if you're going to do one thing, always go more that way because it gives you wonderful elasticity to use in downswing. So much of what we'll talk about tomorrow, how elastic we are as a mover. If you're going to be one way, have more rotation through your pelvis and backswing than less, because it then gives you so much more usable range in transition. So the idea of constraining the pelvis, yeah, I'm sure about that. But so you look at then how that blue plot starts to display. It's actually very flat through most of the backswing. Once he's put himself back in the middle, the pelvis is actually then quite controlled. So a lot of these movements that you see is simply just how they kind of restore homeostasis, regulate their start positions. Equally, this player actually missed, I should know the answer to this, pretty much the most of a year. It will come to me at some point. Through a stress fracture of his lumbar spine. He had a stress fracture to low back. You actually look at the PT value now, it's a very high, what we call B value. So it means the rib cage is actually bending backwards relative to the pelvis, which is your very good question there. So we actually have someone actively in extension or backward bend, depending on what reference you want to use. When you look at what it does to the spine, what tissues, what muscles we use, and the compression it creates, and the irritation it creates, and what it makes the spine move through, If we know that, why would you actively ever encourage? That's like saying we know what smoking does, so why would you ever say to someone, have a cigarette? We know what damage it does to us, unfortunately. But I think it's like a lot of this stuff, and that's why I think everyone's right on what they say today, that we thought smoking was good in the 50s, and look at that turned out. And it's a bit like that with this stuff now. It's very core to have these discussions. Let's see where we're at in 3 or 4 years' time when you've had 3 or 4 years of moving these ways, and it's all getting a little bit unpleasant now. So, but that is just the modern world. You can say what you want without consequence because it's called social media. It's not real evidence-based, good science, good research, because you can just say what you want. So I think a lot of these guys, it seems to be a theme, isn't it? Every year has something. This year's all about, just about speed this year. That's all it is. No one's actually discussed how you produce speed. Next year we've got something different. Last year was all about ground reaction force. The year before about TrackMan. And every year, as you say, has its fashion. So I think golf in some ways has become fashion over function. We forgot function. We've just gone fashionable now, but fashion's changing. And I think for every guy you have it, for every pin-up you have, there's a lot of they call it in the US, collateral damage. Oh, we keep those guys quiet. Because we've got this pin-up we can sell you. He does it our way, and so therefore I told you I was right, but we'll forget those 10 guys you messed up to produce R1. That's just not ethical, but maybe that's me. Okay, so so example in this case, that really for me the theme in the morning, that much of what you see here, very common movements. Most of us have seen it, most of us are exposed to it, we still do it. I'm sure we'll see elements of this afternoon and tomorrow when we have some live players come in. It just connects back to really how they move around their start position, those standing postures that we have. So really, it's a nice way to kind of almost press pause on this morning. If you're going to do one thing well, just stand well. It's a bit dull. It doesn't sell that great on social media. I'd probably get 2 followers, not 1 then. If you talked about just standing well every day, because it's not particularly cool and it's all very dull and whatever, give me something exciting. But it's the reality of what we do just to stand well. And I think normally when you stand well, it certainly helps you move well. And certainly with some of these examples here, that everything they do within their swing, some of these movements which are actively encouraged by some, are just how they move around those start positions, which is just a whole staggering discussion then as to where this stuff's come from. But it's come from people not really understanding, I don't think, actually how those values are produced within these 3D systems.